For this last part of our lesson of this week, we're going to take a look at some of the forgotten founding fathers. What's curious is we often think of George Washington as our very first president, and in some ways he was. He was the first president under the United States Constitution who actually served 4 years. But what you may not be aware of is that there were actually 14 presidents who came before Washington, because they were presidents of the Continental Congress, who each served 1-year terms. Several of them served under the Articles of Confederation, which was our first Constitution. Now, these men, although they're forgotten largely to history, some of them are more famous than others, however, are important to remember, because it's important to see how rich the past is, particularly in this generation of this section of world history. The first man I want you to note was a leader by the name of Peyton Randolph. And Peyton Randolph came from Virginia. In fact, he was a great lawyer from Virginia who had tutored men like Patrick Henry. And Randolph famously, when he was only 13 years old, felt that he had failed as a student because he had not read as many books as his father had read in his father's entire lifetime. It shows you the idea of covenant succession, the idea that these founding fathers often had when they wanted to build upon what their parents had done. We also know about Peyton Randolph that he had incredible talents. For example, he could write 2 different letters with 2 different hands at the same time, sometimes even in different languages. We also know about stories regarding Peyton Randolph that when he entered a room, people typically got quiet to see what he would do or say. In other words, he was a man who had the gift of presence. He was able, just by entering into a place, to command respect. Washington also had that gift. The second of the 6 leaders we're going to talk about today, we're not going to get to all 14 of them, that's something you can do separately, is the man by the name of John Hancock. And Hancock you've probably heard of. In fact, he's famous because his name appears in the largest scale or font on the Declaration of Independence. That's because he was president when the Declaration was signed. Now, Hancock came from Boston, Massachusetts, and was himself a very wealthy businessman. In fact, he was probably the wealthiest man in Massachusetts at the time, was known for his extravagant coaches and his quite beautiful and expensive clothes. So he showed incredible taste. But Hancock also showed his virtue when he argued that it was a holy duty to oppose tyranny. And perhaps what's most incredible about Hancock is that Hancock was willing to risk all of that comfort, all of his fortune, and all of his reputation for the cause of liberty. It's what makes him an incredible character. As a result, he became president of the Continental Congress. He was also the first president to begin the tradition of Thanksgiving Day proclamations. So this whole concept of giving a great speech to commemorate Thanksgiving Day, but also to call people to prayer, especially to pray for the new nation. The next character we'll talk about was a man by the name of Henry Laurens, who came from South Carolina. Laurens himself came from a French background. His family had been Huguenots over in France years and years before. And Laurens had spent time abroad in Europe, where he recognized that the Reformation really provided the backbone for liberty, for independence, for true freedom in modern government. And so Laurens, who became a brilliant prisoner, is perhaps most famous for what he didn't do well. That's because when he was traveling on ship, his ship was stopped by the British Navy, and when they recognized that Laurens was the president of what they considered a rebellious government, they arrested him and shipped him back to the Tower of London, where he was actually a prisoner for 4 years. It's during this time that Laurens recognized that despite all of his training, despite all of his fortune back home, he really had to latch on to what he called the permanent things. So he returned to things like prayer and scripture to actually have something eternal to hold fast to. Eventually, he would be released from prison when the British decided to exchange him for Cornwallis, who had been captured himself. John Jay is the next character we'll look at. He's rather famous. He was a lawyer from New York. He himself was in charge of several of the spies during the War of Independence. After the war, he would be one of the great writers of the Federalist Papers, which argued in favor of the Constitution. He would go on to become the Secretary of State, he would become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he would serve as the chairman of the American Bible Society. He was one of the incredible early leaders. Next, we have Elias Boudinot, who also came from a French background. In fact, he was a statesman from New Jersey. And during the War for Independence, prior to him serving as president, he actually was a great ambassador to the British who always argued for the rights of prisoners captured. He also was put in charge of making certain that American prisoners had proper clothing, proper food, proper access to medical care, that sort of thing. What's incredible, though, is that they often didn't, and the British expected the Americans to pay for that. But the Continental Congress typically had no money, or they had worthless money, which the British would not accept. And so Boudinot actually had to purchase things like blankets, things like food, things like medicine, often out of his own banking account. It's what made him an incredibly sacrificial man. He also would serve as chairman of the American Bible Society, which was a group designed to send out Bibles to places that didn't know them or could not afford them. He himself would adopt many into his family, and would also have descendants who would help lead the Cherokee Nation unto its own greatness as well. The next character we'll take a look at was a man by the name of Richard Henry Lee, who was a planter from Virginia, came from that famous Lee family. He also risked an enormous estate and an enormous fortune to pursue what he believed was right. He also was one of the leaders that got the Declaration of Independence passed and then signed by the Continental Congress. He himself and the rest of the Lee family were very close to the Adams family of Massachusetts. In fact, Lee would name one of his sons Samuel Adams Lee. He himself would become the grand uncle to another famous Lee, Robert E. Lee, who will show up in our history lessons later. Finally, the last president to ever serve prior to Washington is a lesser-known man by the name of Cyrus Griffin. And Cyrus Griffin, who was the man who understood that his time and the whole Articles of Confederation were coming to an end. And so he worked diligently to make certain the Constitution was actually passed. Now, the point of you writing these characters down, the point of you knowing a little bit about each of these men, because we've only scratched the surface, is for you to recognize how rich the background is, how rich the legacy of American history actually is. You can look at any slice of our history and you will find characters like this, as you would probably find if you look around you at your neighborhood or at your church or at other communities that you are involved with.